Hi, this is Shambhavi. Welcome to my weekly podcast about spirituality, love, death, devotion, and waking up while living in a messy world. The Satsang with Shambhavi podcast is recorded live each week with students of our nonprofit community, Jayakula. For more information and to find out about attending a satsang, visit jayakula.org. Thanks for listening. Much love to you, wherever and however you are.
You can just talk a little bit about using tools from different lineages and traditions. So I know here in Jayakula, you learn practices from Dzogchen and from Trika. And for me, having kind of a strain of skepticism, sometimes I'm that's not pure, or that's not kosher or something. So if you can just clarify.
Okay, so I think a little bit of history is in order. So first of all, in the mix along the Silk Road, where these direct realization traditions really took root, there was enormous sharing and exchange and practicing in many different traditions. So for instance, Laleshwari, the Kashmiri yogini, had a Sufi teacher. She had a Kashmir Shaivism teacher. Abhinavagupta studied with many different traditions. And in fact, our own tradition is synthetic, meaning that it's a weaving together of multiple traditions. Back in the day, when Abhinavagupta was around, one of those traditions was Trika, only one of them. But there were 6 other traditions. The Pratyabhijna, the Krama, the Kaula. I don't really ever remember all of them, but those are the ones that always come to mind. So they were all, in general, tantric traditions or direct realization, but they were separate traditions with separate lineages and separate preceptors. In addition, some of those traditions were very influenced by Buddhism that was also around in the same geographic location and where there was lots of exchange between people in those locations. In Buddhist traditions today, especially those from Tibet, students are actually encouraged to get teachings from teachers in different Buddhist traditions. And it's really only in both Hindu and Tibetan Buddhist traditions, there is this thing called Satguru or Root Lama. And that means your main teacher. So in all of those traditions, there is this idea that if you're lucky, if you have that karma, then you're going to meet with a teacher who is sort of your teacher for this life or perhaps many lifetimes. But having met that person, it's okay to also study with other people and get teachings from other places. And in fact, in the Tibetan Buddhist traditions and continuing in the Tibetan Buddhist diaspora, people travel all over the world, including Tibetan practitioners and teachers, not just Western people. People travel all over the place, getting a teaching from here and here and here. So it's more prevalent in the Hindu traditions to be told you have one teacher and you should only get teachings from that teacher. And that's certainly how I was taught. But I've since realized that was maybe not the best teaching. So, and there actually were times when I was told to go study with other teachers too, but those were much rarer than you'll find, for instance, in Tibetan Buddhist traditions. So that's one aspect of it, that this sort of idea that you shouldn't study in synthetic traditions, because most of the traditions we have today are synthetic just by nature. So that idea that you shouldn't do that is, I think, a lack of understanding of how these traditions actually get formed, and also somewhat over-controlling, in certain lineages. There's that. Then there is both the ordinary history and esoteric history of Dzogchen and Trika Shaivism or Shaiva Tantra. It's called different things, which have so much in common historically in terms of who was learning from who. For instance, Padmasambhava, walked through Kashmir and had contact with and shared things with teachers in Trika Shaivism also before he went into Tibet. So there was all kinds of historical sharing among these traditions, Buddhist and Hindu alike, and particularly Dzogchen and Trika have almost identical views and some extremely similar practices. Like the practice of the White is in both Trika and in Dzogchen and considered to be a central practice. The practice of Guru Yoga is central to both traditions. The idea that you're just relaxing into the nature of the self or the natural state, the sort of basic building blocks of these traditions of both the practice and the view are identical, really. And then the way that the progress of the student is described is very similar, that you have this recognition of something, then you have to integrate with that, then you have to integrate that into your everyday life. Those three basic steps are absolutely foundational to both traditions. Then there is just sort of this uncanny similarity that in my mind has to do with the way that wisdom traditions are transmitted into the human realm by dakinis or wisdom beings. And I'm really convinced that they're, sort of the same wisdom beings. I don't know if you can really say that. But one of the practices that I was given and that I did most assiduously and with good fruit is Sri Vidya practice with the Sri Yantra. I read a lot of books about that practice after I was given it, and I found something in a very old text that was very startling to me, because the dakinis of Dzogchen come from or live in a place that is both possibly in ancient times was a physical place, which was exactly the same as Kashmir and the Swat Valley, where the traditions that we know of, that we practice Trika, came from those places. And this place where Dzogchen is said to have come from, Odiyana, is the exact same geographic location. However, Odiyana is also, in Dzogchen, Dakini land. It's where Dakinis live. So it's a subtle geography. It's not just a physical geography. And I was reading this very old book about the Sri Chakra and that practice, Sri Vidya. And this was from Hindu tradition. And it said, and in the center of the Sri Yantra is Odiyana. And it just blew my mind. I've never read this anywhere else, but, and obviously it's not proof of anything, but it just kind of blew my mind. And that's where it was from that I got this opening or gateway to thinking that the esoteric landscape and the dakinis are the same for both traditions. Both traditions have termas or treasure texts or transmitted texts. Both have that tradition. The other piece of it, which is even perhaps more esoteric, is that I've had dreams that have basically informed me that I was practicing Dzogchen in a different life. And in fact, I've had this one teacher has come to me several times in dreams and said, so are you going to come back and practice Dzogchen again? I'm like, no, I'm doing Trika now. Sorry, that's what I always say. So just in terms of me personally, when I was first learning certain things in Dzogchen from my teacher, I actually had memories of them come to me without being taught them. We were learning some things in stages, and we were learning this practice, and I was seeing the mudras of this practice before we had been taught them, and just doing them spontaneously with my hands, and then going and getting the teaching the next week, and those were the mudras that were part of the practice. So I don't mind you being skeptical about it. That's fine. I'm not going to fight anybody on this. But in my mind, I was already doing this before. And so for me, as someone who has practiced for almost my entire life and other lives too, apparently, I am teaching from the place of my direct experience. And to me, there's not really any difference between the experience that's described in Dzogchen and Trika. And I have very, very profound connections with both of these traditions. So, and I also think that most teachers, having reached a certain consistency in their ability to be immersed in presence and to relate to things in a more subtle way, I think that most teachers kind of step off the known landscape and end up just teaching from their experience in whatever way spontaneously occurs. And certainly that's my case. And I started noticing this, I don't really know when, but some years ago. And I remember, because in the beginning I used to teach only Trika things. Then I had very, very special kinds of openings and understandings that came through doing the Dzogchen 6 realms thing. And at that point that I felt I had to teach that because I didn't want to keep that realization to myself. And then that kind of opened the floodgates. I would say still 75% of the actual practices we learn are from Trika or from the Yoga Kendu tradition, from my original Diksha lineage. And then, another 25% are the Dzogchen teachings practices. But I have to say that some of them are just things I spontaneously come up with out of my own experience that draws on both of these traditions. It isn't something I was taught by a teacher. And that is something that I would never have done for most of the time that I was teaching. I just didn't do it, and I wouldn't have done it. But it started just happening, and I kind of started tiptoeing into that more unknown landscape some years ago. And I remember being a little worried about it back then. But you know what? At the end of the day, you just have to have confidence in what's coming toward you and in knowing sort of where you're at spiritually, and that's what I'm doing. So I'm still extremely cautious, maniacal, I would say, about not teaching things I don't know about from personal experience. But then having had that personal experience, there's a certain amount of creativity and spontaneity and free form that just starts to naturally occur. And that's where I'm at now.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, like, what I could do just, like, practically, because, I love both practices and all that. And I know the point is not to, like, identify, like, I'm a Trika student, I'm a Dzogchen student. Mm-hmm. But, like, what can I do practically to kind of, like, get unstuck?
You know, as I said, 75% of what I'm teaching comes from the Trika tradition. And certainly I know the Trika, in this life anyway, I know the Trika tradition much more thoroughly than Dzogchen. My relationship to Dzogchen in this life is not the same as my relationship to Trika. I have studied the texts of Trika for decades. I wrote a dissertation that drew on a lot of the texts of Trika. You know, I've studied with a few synthetic teachers and learned a lot of practices from this tradition. In Dzogchen, I haven't done that. I had one teacher. Well, I had a couple of other teachers for little things. They were not even very important. But I had one main teacher who taught me some very specific practices and the basic view of Dzogchen. And, you know, I've read some things because I do that. But basically, I just had really profound realization doing those practices. But I never learned all the ritual practices that Namkhai Norbu taught. I never was a part of his community in any full-time sense. You know, I was definitely an outlier in that community. But nonetheless, the practices that I did, I had some very deep realization, and that's where it's coming through. It's not coming through in the same more scholarly, studied way, knowing more practices and ritual. I studied Hindu puja. I never studied Dzogchen puja. It's very, very different. So I would say that I have the essence of Dzogchen, but none of the trappings, really. So most of what we're doing here is Trika, or from the Hindu yogic tradition. A lot of the practices from my Diksha lineage were from the yogic tradition, not really specifically Trika. But all of the kriyas that we learn, or most of them, especially the heart-based kriyas and meditation style, is from Trika. That's why I just started calling it direct realization. It was a term that I saw used in Trika text, and then I found it in Ma also. And I just thought, okay, this is perfect. Pratyaksha Darshana, that's what it is, direct realization. All of these other labels are less important to me now.
Why not Taoism? Is it, at the day you're choosing not, is it aesthetic sometimes?
I mean, I studied dream yoga with a Taoist teacher, small, very discrete things. So why am I not calling it Taoism, are you saying?
Oh, okay, so you didn't study a lot of Taoism.
No, not at all. I mean, the divinatory text I used was created by a Taoist teacher, so I know some flavor of that has crept in too. But basically, what I'm teaching is really directly from my own experience, having done the practices that I am now teaching you. If you have a crisis, I would say just, surf it and enjoy it and see where you land.
I think all of those traditions have the attitude of, like, whatever works is what works. And maybe I'm oversimplifying it. Maybe I need to identify as a particular type of practitioner, but to me it just seems like whatever, within all direct realization traditions, it seems like the attitude is like, well, that's what works for you, that's what works for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's true, but there's a couple things about that. There actually are deep and wide historical and esoteric commonalities between Dzogchen and Trika. I don't think they're really entirely separate traditions on lots of different levels. And then there's the fact that there's just a lot of people out there claiming that they have some authentic connection to stuff that they don't. So students have to be careful about that, right? And at the end of the day, having a teacher who has the stamp of approval of a single lineage in some normal, conventional way really doesn't protect you, as we have seen. So where does that leave you? I could say, well, I was given this lineage and that lineage and blah, blah, blah. I'm in a direct line to Abhinavagupta. This is not true. If there were such a person, that person could still be an asshole. So that just doesn't protect you. The only thing that protects you is having a good teacher who has practiced and realized the practices. And if you feel that is true, then you are going to have to be mature and rely on your own perceptions and your own feeling about things. And that should be true with any teacher. But lots of people get false sense of confidence from the trappings or the ornaments of lineage or accomplishment as the brand accomplishments or something. And then they feel cheated or ripped off or betrayed when it turns out somebody didn't behave well. And really, that's also a rather immature attitude, because we really need to rely on our own sense of things, our own encounter with the teacher. Is the teacher really helping us? Does the teacher seem to be walking the walk? We just have to take a chance and have confidence in our own perceptions and then go with that and try to learn as much as we can. I mean, that's just true no matter what the teacher says about themselves or anybody else says about them. And too often students hand that over to signs and symbols of authority when they don't actually pause to think, does this person actually have spiritual authority or not, according to my perception? Because that's all that matters. And I've many, many times told the story of Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche when he was in his 20s and he was studying with all kinds of famous people. And he went to get a certain practice from this guy out in the countryside in Tibet. And the guy was dressed not well, kind of fumbly, couldn't do the rituals right. And, at first, Namkhai Norbu was like turning his nose up at this guy and thinking what a fool he was. And it turned out this guy was actually his root teacher and actually knew what Dzogchen was more than any of the other people. So we really are just going to have to trust our own perceptions at some point, no matter what. And that's the mature thing to do. And then if we have a misperception, it's the mature thing to do is go, oh, I guess I was limited in my perceptions. Because believe me, there's people out there who have teachers that I would not want to have lunch with. I wouldn't want to have a coffee with these people. You just meet them and you know that they're just not the kind of people that have the accomplishment they say they do. And they're braggarts and egotists and manipulators and liars. But then there's students who love them and think they're totally enlightened. So what do you do if you're one of those people and then you found out you made a mistake? You just say, well, my perceptions were limited and now they're less limited. I finally noticed that this person was a jerk. This is being mature.
I've been wondering what was Ma's practice?
So Ma didn't have a practice like we do. There are, many nines of human beings have to practice in order to sensitize and subtleize their perceptions so that they can see what's really going on here. But then there's another class of beings who show up every now and then called avatars. And the avatars are something like direct emanations of wisdom, and they arrive and they're already completely awake. And they come to show us what is possible in human life. And it's also said that they come to make course corrections of some sort in human life. Or animal life, because there have been animal avatars too. So the avatars that you've probably heard of are Krishna and Ram. Jesus is considered to be an avatar. The Christians don't consider Jesus to be an avatar, but a lot of Hindus do. And Ma also, she was an avatar. She identified herself as in that line of avatars of Vishnu. And by her own self-report, she was completely lucid from the moment of her arrival here, and was always, as she reported many, many times, always in the same condition. She did go through a 7-year period where she was getting these downloads, spontaneous downloads of tens of thousands of different practices were just moving through her and being accomplished in a moment so that she could be a good teacher to humans. And so she never did practice for the same reasons that we did. She manifested practices spontaneously to learn them for the benefit of all beings. That's what I think anyway. You can have your doubts, but having read a lot of Ma's life and read all of her teachings in English that I could find, and having my own personal experiences of her through my sadhana and dreams and things, I have no doubt that whatever you want to call her, she was very, very special kind of a being.